Hello and welcome back to PolyToots. We're going to be carrying on with the Borderlands asset, and as usual there is something that I forgot in the last episode, so it's these front plate bits. I forgot to give them a retopo, so we're just going to do that now. But I first am going to just swap back over to the sculpt room just to cut off this this sort of thin top portion. We don't need it there, and you know it's going to make the retopo a little bit annoying, so I'm just going to use the cutoff tool and get rid of it. And so then back over to the retopo room. I am going to make a new layer for this just to keep things simple. And again, I'm going to give it the same name that the sculpt layer has because we will be using the baking with named correspondence. So just using points and faces for most of it, and then finishing off with the quads tool just because the points and faces was having some trouble trying to put in that last quad. And then I'm just going to grab the edges of this new piece, and using the transform tool I'll scale them just so that I know they're straight. I'll also push them into the base mesh just so that I know for sure that we're not going to get any weird gaps in our geometry. And I have noticed at the top here, after we do the bake, we probably will end up with a little bit of a see-through gap here. We could just move this edge down now, but I'm worried that that might mess with the bake a little too much because, you know, there's quite a big difference here. Not that it really matters, this is a pretty kind of small asset, but I just decided to leave it alone, and hopefully I'll remember to just move that edge down after we have done the bake. Or if not, at least after we export it all out and set it all up for animation. Or I might just forget completely, who knows. Secondly, I did notice that I have some pretty strange geometry happening on my lid. I think this is a result of me using the transform tool in the sculpt room and having the retopo object follow the sculpt. As I said before, like, it works quite well for doing small changes, but essentially 3D Coat is trying to keep all of your verts in the same place, and it can quite easily mess up a bit. And so for the most part it's completely fine, but I think that's what caused this little issue here. So I am just turning on my symmetry again and then enabling the points and faces tool and using the middle mouse button on my pen just to move those back into place. Alright, cool. So now that all of my mistakes are dead and buried, it is now time to actually start unwrapping. But we're going to just enable that name correspondence for baking checkbox. And we'll do this now just so that we don't forget later, although if we do forget later it will be very obvious. And so what this means is that your sculpt layers and your retopo layers need to match up by name, because whatever you name a retopo layer, it will grab from the sculpt layer that's called the same thing. And this does include child objects. So you see here I am just moving the bits and the corner pieces into the base layer because I plan to bake these out from the base retopo. Hopefully this isn't too confusing. It might make more sense as I continue on, but one easy way to make sure that everything is lined up and correct is to just reorder your retopo layers to be in the same order as your sculpt layers, and then you can cross-reference the names, and then you will immediately see if there is anything missing or something that needs to be added. And so you can see here that I had a lift retopo layer, and that was a part of the flippy outy bits. And so it didn't make sense for it to be its own retopo layer. So my two choices here were either get the lift out of that sculpt layer and so basically parent it to the root, or as I did here, I just grabbed all of the faces in that lift layer and then just moved them into the correct layer. And now I have an empty layer that I can just remove. And so when all of that's done and everything is kind of lined up and making sense, then we can actually start unwrapping. I mean, we could have started unwrapping before, but at least now we know that everything will eventually bake out correctly. So if there is a problem, we know that it's not here, it's somewhere else. So it's a good step to take. I prefer to tackle each of these one by one, and so I'll just start with the top, which is our base layer, and we're just going to use the Mark Seams tool. And this is basically how we apply these seams. And 3D Coat's unwrapping stuff is pretty cool. Like it will automatically unfold your geometry. So you make the splits and it takes care of everything else. One pretty important thing that's worth noting is the symmetry is tied to the sculpt layers. So whichever sculpt layer you have selected, it will use that symmetry. So you can either kind of just work on like the base retopo layer and have the base sculpt layer selected just to make sure that it's using the correct symmetry that you had when you were modeling. But ultimately it is up to you. You might decide that you don't want the same symmetry. Oftentimes it's just easier to kind of stick with the same layer, the same sculpt layer selected, and then just manually change the symmetry as and when you need to. And if you wanted to select entire loops of edges, you just have to hold down the shift key. And if you want to undo a seam, just hold the control key. I think at least that holding the control and the shift key will undo the loop that you have selected. Now as for where you place these seams, that is entirely up to you. I'm trying to be a bit mindful here in that some pieces will get a lot of mirroring and overlaid pieces, whereas others I would like them to be quite unique. So you can see on this base for the inside and the underside, I am splitting the seams there into quarters because I know later on that after I do the unwrap, I can just overlay those to just use the same UV space, whereas the front and the back of this thing are actually unique. And the only reason that I've split them like this is just you don't really want gigantic UV islands in your UV sheet because especially with the size of this thing, that can actually end up taking like way more space than any of your assets require, which makes optimizing your UV sheet a little tricky. Also, one other nice thing about 3D Coats Unwrapper is it is pretty much always trying to unwrap. So if you have some simple geometry here, like my chain, I don't need to apply any seams or do anything to it. It is good to go. We still need to perform the unwrap, but in terms of the shape that it thinks it should be, it's completely fine. So we can just skip that entirely. For pieces like this, these cylinders, I do prefer to keep their UV islands whole, so I will split them in an area that makes the most sense, that allows them to unwrap nicely, but then I will, holding the control key, join a seam or two back just so that they are joined. And this it's completely optional. It's more for my peace of mind because I guess I'm coming from quite an old school approach in that your UV islands still have to make sense. Like, it's still entirely possible for you to be working on this not inside like a 3D painter, but rather having to work on it in Photoshop. And it's a lot easier to make sense of UV islands when the shapes of them make sense, whereas if I were to split things up into too many pieces, it can get confusing as to what it actually is, and you end up having to sort of just paint random colors on things and then have a look at it inside like a model viewer or your engine of choice just to work out what it is you're actually painting. So I try to alleviate those issues, even though nowadays it is kind of a redundant practice because most things now are done in things like 3D Code or Substance Painter, or other tools are available. And so there's not really much else to say. I think similar to a lot of the retopo stuff we were doing, I will just speed through bits, and if I see anything that is worth mentioning, I will stop and mention it. But for the most part, this is one of the easiest parts of the job. The difficulty comes from just having to decide what should be mirrored and what shouldn't be. What you want to overlay, what you want to be unique. But yeah, aside from that, just roll with it. And even afterwards, if you find that you've unwrapped everything and you've done your bake and you just decide that you don't like it, then it's okay to just go back and redo it. So yeah, as I say, I will just speed through things now. I'll either be back when we get ready to do the unwrap, or if there's something else that pops up, then I will mention it. Okay, so this is one area that will probably need a little re-explanation. I was mentioning before about symmetry being sort of tied to the sculpt layers, and you can ignore that and just keep changing the symmetry like as you decide to go with things. But this particular object, because it's made up of lots of other objects, it is a kind of special case scenario where I do sometimes want to use symmetry on the X. I'll also use no symmetry at all. So it's up to you kind of how you want to do these things. It's all interchangeable. Oh, and I did notice that I forgot to clip out a bit of geometry on the inside here, so I was wondering why my seams were getting all kind of weird. I just had to remove those faces and then all was hunky-dory. But yeah, anyway, just a quick little note just to say it is okay to keep changing the symmetry of your retopo layer, because I mean ultimately it's not looking at the symmetry as a whole. You can do symmetry on one axis for a large portion of your layer and then just turn the symmetry off and keep going. It won't undo the work you've done. So yeah, you can see that most of this is actually quite symmetrical, and yet there are unique pieces like that whole bit in the middle, because I know later on that I'm going to have this sort of grating style texture. Oh, and there's also some other pieces here that we're missing, so just filling those in. Not entirely sure where that happened, but it is what it is. Alright, so we're approaching the end of this speedy unwrap now. I hope it wasn't too fast, but I mean, like I said before, it's just up to you where you want these seams. So now we're actually going to do the unwrap, and you do that by hitting the unwrap button. And as you can see, we have a boatload of pieces here. And if you wanted like a full unique unwrap, then you're done. Basically, you don't need to watch the rest of this. Not the whole video. You don't want to skip the whole video. We will cover the bake, but if you didn't want to do anything else with your unwrap, then you were done. But for me, I'm going to just go over a few methods of how to overlay some of these UV islands, and there's two ways to do it. One way is just you grab the pieces by selecting them on the UV preview, and if you're in the Mark Seams tool, it will just grab them. So you can select pieces and then just do a Control-C to copy, and then you select the piece that you want to overlay them onto, and then you just hit Control-V, and that will just move them onto them, which is pretty cool. The quicker way to do this, but this really kind of depends on your retopo layer, is to actually make use of symmetry. And so if you know, for example, that everything in a retopo layer should be symmetrical on one axis or two axes, then you can hide all of the other retopo layers, turn on your symmetry, and then just hit that symmetrical copy button, and that will just overlay all of the symmetrical pieces, which is pretty cool. But like I said, that only works on layers where you want that full symmetrical copy. So on my base layer, for example, in fact even on a lot of my layers, like the base and the lid, we were mixing and matching our symmetry types, so that solution wouldn't really be any use to us. It would just make its own seams, and it would just quarter or half up our entire unwrap, and it would make a lot of the work that we've done marking those seams a bit redundant. So yeah. The last thing that I can think to mention is if you are trying to do symmetrical copies or Control-C, Control-V, but one shape isn't going over to another and they even look a little strange, it's probably because there's some kind of inconsistency, like I have here with the handle. It turns out for some reason that a seam wasn't marked on one side. So when that happens and you've already done a whole bunch of unwrapping stuff, you don't have to worry about unwrapping again. You can just apply the seam or whatever change you need to, and then hit the Update Islands button, and now you should be able to copy one onto the other because they should be identical. So once all that's done and you're pretty happy with everything, you can just hit the pack UV button, and that will just try to organize it in the most optimal way possible. Alternatively, if you prefer to keep the orientation of some islands in a specific way, you can use the pack UV2 option, and that will basically perform the same thing, but it won't rotate any of your pieces. And so now we are ready to bake this out, but first of all we're just going to hop back to the sculpt room and apply one of the more default materials, or rather a material that will actually bake out correctly, because 3D Coat has two types of shaders, maybe more, I'm not sure, but I know that one of them will bake fine and the others will not, and it's not entirely obvious which is which, so I just happen to know that this one is okay. And so now we're going to bake this out and send it into the paint room. So we do that by selecting that option there to bake with a normal map. And I don't ordinarily bake everything out as one whole piece, but I am just doing this at first just to get like a rough idea as to you know, any kind of obvious problems. So I will explain a little bit more about what's happening later on, but yeah, as I say, this is just a test, so I'm just going to run through this and then we'll see. Okay, so yeah, once that's done, I will hop over to the paint room and make sure you have the box tree window there and hide the root layer. Otherwise your sculpt will be visible in the paint room, which is super annoying, but you know, it is what it is. Yeah, so I'm just having a look around this just to see if there's any obvious issues, and I mean, to be honest, it's not a bad bake. There are some oddities here and there, but they're completely expected, I would say. And some of them we're likely not going to fix entirely. We can probably paint a lot of this stuff out when it comes to the texturing anyway, so I'm not too fussed. I'm mostly just looking out for any massive, glaringly obvious mistakes that we can't just patch away with a paint job. And for the most part, like no, I think it's all pretty good, but I do notice here that my chain object is a little low res. I mean, it is 1:1 ratio with the rest of the EUVs, and so it doesn't need to really be any bigger, but I do decide just to scale it up where possible, and if I have the extra space in the UV sheet to do it, then, you know, might as well. But yeah, once my test is concluded, I will just remove all of the paint objects just by clicking on the X, and then I'll go over to the layers window, and there's a button down there to remove any layer that isn't used, and since we've already removed the objects, it will automatically remove the layers as well. So back over to the Retopo room, I am just going to select my chain unwrap, and I'm just going to scale it up myself and just move it wherever I think it can fit the best. You will see that it turns a bit red, and that's basically 3D Coat telling you that like something's not quite right here, like there's something not 1:1 with these UVs. But since I know that I'm making this larger than the other pieces by comparison, it's fine. I can ignore the fact that it's trying to tell me that it's wrong, because it's not wrong. And so now I've hidden my lid piece, and I'm going to do a bake again because I want to do those two pieces separately. I could probably still be a bit more nitpicky with this and bake out more pieces on their own, but the results of the test bake were actually okay, so I am feeling a bit confident in just making 2 separate bakes instead of, you know, like 8. So the idea here is you want your inside cage to obviously be inside the mesh, like you shouldn't be able to see it poking outside, whereas your outer cage definitely needs to be outside of your sculpt. So once I was happy with that, again, just running through the bake procedure, waiting for it to bake off, and I do see that I do have some new issues. I think either that or maybe they were there before and I just hadn't noticed, but I know why they're there, and it's going to be much easier to just remove them in the texturing stage than trying to get the bake absolutely perfect. So I'm okay with this bake for now. I'll just tidy it up later. And so now I'm ready to bake out the lid piece on its own, but one annoying feature here is that we can still see the objects that are in the paint room. So if you just want to make things visually not confusing, you can find the window to get the paint objects, which is the exact same thing that's in the paint room, and then you can just hide them from here. So now you know that there's just your sculpt and there's just your retopo. And so with the lid only here, I am just going to go through again and just put in some different numbers for the inside and outside. And yeah, I'm not too happy with it, so I decide to bring the outside shell in a bit so it does actually clip through, which is like the opposite of what I told you to do before. But there is a nice little feature here in that you can actually just paint across the surface to essentially expand your cage manually, and this is a really nice feature. And you can hold, I believe, control to contract the cage rather than pushing it out. So the idea was I brought the cage in globally to where I thought most of it would fit, and then the bits that were poking through, I just went over and pushed them out a bit. And then just kind of run through, and I leave all of these settings as you see there. And then again over to the paint room, and again make sure you hide the Vox layer. And I'm just going to bring back the visibility of all of my paint objects, and I'll have a look around. And as you can see, we are still getting some issues here. In fact, arguably this is worse than it was before, but this is still completely fixable. And yeah, I see that some of the issues are caused like not by the normal map, it would seem. So that's just a color thing, but there are some issues which we will need to tidy up in the normal map itself, but that is to be expected. And you know, as I say before, you're not really going to get a perfect bake, so you can expect a little bit of touch-up. And now, because we've done 2 bakes, 3D Coat has this feature, I suppose, which I really hope that they can change in the future. But basically, even though both of our channels were the same, it still created 2 different UV channels. So to fix this, we need to go over to the UV room, and then up here, you select one of your layers. And if they're all called the same, I prefer to work from the bottom to the top. So I've just selected the bottommost layer. And I'm just going to select all of the islands in there, and then up in this menu here you can just say, you know, move selected into a new one, which will be our top one. It is a little bit confusing. I imagine if both of my layers weren't called default, then maybe this could have been explained better, but I hope you get the idea at least. It's the same logic as in the Retopo room when we were moving faces from one layer to another, but all this is we're just moving UV information from one layer into another. And then once that's done, you can apply your UV sets, which you need to do. Then afterwards, you can go up to the menu, and there's a drop down there to delete the unused UV sets. And if you do go back into the paint room and you get this pop-up telling you that you've made a change and you haven't applied, I think that's actually potentially a bug. This never used to happen to me before if I was just removing UV sets, so you can just ignore that. And so now if you see over here in our texture editor, we do only have 1 channel, which is good. And so yeah, that is pretty much it. There is one little thing that I forgot to do, and unfortunately I'm sat here editing now and I'm finished with the project, so it's going to be another thing that we will fix in the start of the next video. But I did actually want my chain UV to be completely separate, and this is mostly for optimization reasons, in that we're going to use an alpha channel on it, but there's no point in having like a giant texture where 99% of it has no alpha and then just one little portion is the bit that contains alpha. It essentially means that you're treating your whole object as a transparent object, but you're deciding in a texture which bits are and are not transparent, and it's just it's a needless calculation. My apologies for forgetting that one. We will fix that right up at the start of the next video. And then, yeah, we'll carry on with me showing you how to fix up some of these paint issues. Although, spoiler alert, I have done a video on this before. It's got like an icon of 2 crystals or something like that if you wanted to get a head start. And then once we're all happy with the bake and everything's fixed, and we have our 2 channels for the alpha and the chest as a whole, then we'll actually start texturing this thing. Thank you very much for watching. Peace out, and I will see you in the next one.